housing markets in the United States? Again, how will climate migration affect housing markets in the United States?
In a recent interview, US President Donald Trump was asked what the J in Donald J. Trump stood for. In response, he said J stood for genius. But to back up his intellectual genius, he posed the question, if coal is so bad, why don't we burn it all? But it's these exact same takes that are causing temperatures to rise across the globe and contributing to climate change disasters like we saw in Southern California just earlier this year. Take, for example, Dale Fielder, a 64-year-old jazz musician living in LA. He was happily performing at a jazz bar in Florida, but he was shocked when he pulled out his phone and saw frantic calls from his wife. Returning just a day later, he noticed that his neighborhood was burned to a crisp, and his wife's body was caught in flames. Unfortunately, Dale had to abandon his home and travel 200 miles away just to meet his family in the Midwest. Increasingly clear, this problem of climate migration is taking over the US. In fact, the UN quantified on February 10th of 2025 that in the United States alone, we've seen more than 13 million people subjugated to climate migration. Considering that in the future, people in this very audience will be the ones who lose their homes and have to travel hundreds of miles away, it becomes a matter of national significance that we ask today's question. How will climate migration affect housing markets in the United States? The answer is that it will upend stability in three main ways. First, by raising prices in climate havens. Second, by forcing low-income renters to leave their homes. And third, by destabilizing vulnerable regions. Oxymorons, or two words with opposite meanings, define our generation. Take, for example, government intelligence. A working printer, or even affordable housing. But with rising prices in the world, we'll only see affordable housing drop. The New York Times wrote on February 10th of 2025 that as coastal regions like Florida and fire-prone risk areas like California become more risky, people are moving to the Midwest. And I can't believe I'm saying this, but people actually want to go to Des Moines. In fact, the Des Moines Register quantified on September 8th of this year that populations in Iowa and the Midwest have risen by more than 10%, causing prices to rise 20% faster than the rest of the region. And that's also why construction has increased. A separate article by Harvard Center for Home Studies elaborated on February 10th of this year that in Iowa, we've seen construction activity increase by more than 14%. That might be why, as you travel to the Iowa Men's Center today, you saw a plethora of new homes being built. At the end of the day, the result of climate migration is prices in construction soaring to the sky. Now, Maria Straker was a 64-year-old mother living in Des Moines, but due to higher rents, she was forced out of her home. Cut her hair simply to avoid unwanted attention, and the cold concrete floor beneath her reminded her how deep her vulnerability ran. Unfortunately, we'll see only more stories like Maria as climate migration takes effect. A separate article by the Washington Post, this time on March 10th of 2023, explained that in the United States, more than 37 million people are low-income renters, meaning they can barely afford their rent. But when prices rise, the same report goes on to quantify that more than 3.7 million people could be forced out of their homes. Put that in perspective. That's more than the entire population of the city of Dallas, Texas, when entire states are full of unhoused people. It's clear climate migration won't just move people, it'll move millions to the margins. Now, President Trump has some weird takes when it comes to climate change. We've already discussed coal, but he's also claimed that he has a PhD in environmental science, which was so funny even the ice began cracking up. But when there's rising sea levels, President Trump claims there'll be more beachfront property. But instead of beachfront property, we'll be seeing destroyed property. Specifically, the third main impact of climate migration is the destabilization of vulnerable regions. Specifically, in areas like California and Florida, insurance premiums have risen. Take, for example, the New York Times, which quantified on September 8th of 2024 that premiums in California alone have risen by more than 300%, having an abhorrent impact on homeowners trying to afford insurance. Take, for example, Daniel Sweeker, a 54-year-old homeowner in California. He was finally happy to have paid off his mortgage, only to be hit by more bills. And as bills began to rise, he couldn't pay them off. So in the Southern California wildfires, not only did he lose his home, but he lost his future as well. We'll only see more stories of middle-income homeowners being unable to afford insurance and lose their homes in climate change-related disasters. While Monopoly promises Americans they can buy homes in 3 to 4 moves, increasingly, we'll see Americans being unable to afford homes for 3 to 4 decades. So considering, the same report from the UN quantified that by the year 2050, more than 213 million people will be displaced. It's clear the climate issue of climate migration is more important than ever. And while it might seem to local governments that it's impossible to resolve, let's return to the wise words of civil rights activist James Baldwin, when he says, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but absolutely nothing can be changed until it is faced."
Speaker 3 will be cross-examined by Speaker 2, Code 5645.
Great speech. I just have a couple questions. Of course. Now, first, let's take a look at your first and second points about the cost of climate havens increasing and people being forced out of climate-prone areas. Now, isn't it true that your first point is actually a consequence of the second point as people flood into climate havens, thus making them non-unique?
So when we look specifically at homes and prices rising, we're seeing that it's related to more people migrating as a result. But when we specifically analyze my second point, it's a consequence of rising housing prices and shows us the underlying demographics in the housing market.
So you're claiming that housing prices and not climate change are affecting these migration patterns?
We'll see both climate change and housing prices impact those patterns.
All right, let's jump to your third point about destabilization. Isn't it true that during major weather events, like for example, hurricanes in Florida, the government rushed in to provide emergency insurance, which you say that many people can't afford?
Well, so far in California, we've seen more than 14,000 people lose their homes without any semblance of insurance. And at base level, the federal government can't pass legislation quick enough to provide insurance, leaving thousands vulnerable both to losing their homes and their economic livelihoods.
But during the Floridian hurricanes, we actually saw people traverse across the political aisle in order to actually sign legislation. For example, to evacuate elderly people from hurricane-prone areas, or to provide, again, emergency insurance. How can you guarantee that the government won't step in this time, in the future, to ensure the same fate?
When we look at the federal government and specifically look at Congress, we can see that they're gridlocked over the big, beautiful bill, leaving no attention to address future climate disasters.
So being focused on the big, beautiful bill means that they can't focus on any other legislation at the moment?
Well, they're gridlocked and talking about the deficit, specifically a scare that'll increase the deficit by more than 2.6 trillion. And if they're concerned about the deficit now, there's no way they'll consider more insurance premiums for American homeowners.
Given the fact, all right, it's time. Thank you so much.